All right, welcome to our introductory population lecture. For this one, we're going to talk about density and distribution of populations. I created the slides and the lecture, of course, done by myself, and I'm Miss Gall, and I did steal a handful of things from other folks, and you'll see those noted as I go through. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we talk about population density. Really what we're talking about are three different ideas. There's arithmetic density, which is the number of people per unit of space. Think of that kind of like an average. Okay, we might see it, for example, as 35 people per square mile or something like that. Then we've got agricultural density, which is the number of farmers per unit of arable land. And arable is really just a fancy schmancy word that means land that's able to be farmed. So for example, we might see one farmer for every 200,000 acres or something like that, right? And then last but not least, we're going to take the two of those and smash them together and get physiological density. And what we're going to get is, and how we're going to get that is the number of people in a population divided by a unit of arable land. Right, so just using the same numbers from before, we might get, 35 people for every 200,000 acres or things like that. And farms are most commonly measured in acres. One really important thing to note, and that I want you to make sure gets down into your notes, is that densities are not the same as distributions, and they don't show distributions. And there's some real disadvantages to using density as a way of explaining how population is spread out in a space. Okay, when we talk about distribution, we're talking about something very different. And distribution is this idea of how are people spread out in space. Okay, so if density is how many people live in a given unit of space, distribution is really looking at the space itself and seeing where do people live and where do people not live and things like that. So to give you an example, right? If we look over here, we've got China. Look at China, we see a lot of the distribution is that most of the people live on the east coast of China. If you move a little bit west towards the middle of the country, this area is uninhabitable, right? And that, if you're not familiar, actually is the Gobi Desert right through there, right? Similarly, if we look at Africa and we look at where do most of the people live, we've got a few up here along the coast, a little bit in some of these areas, but really most of them we're going to live south of kind of this big huge dividing line. Well, what's that line? That's the desert. Okay, South America, where do the people live? Along the coast, along the coast. What's in here? It's the rainforest. Okay, so when you're talking about distribution, what you really want to look for is where do people tend to cluster? Where do people tend to avoid? And in that way, what you're really asking is how are people dispersed, or how are they spread across the space? Right, if we look, just to give you another idea, if we're looking up here at North America, we say, why are most people not living here? Well, this is a lot of not necessarily super hospitable area to live in. It's very flat. We're looking at kind of the Kansas, Oklahoma area. We get a lot of tornadoes and things like that. As we move further north, why don't a lot of people live in Alaska or live in Canada? And the short answer is it's too cold. Right, so we talk about where do people live in general, right? What's the distribution of people? Generally speaking, people avoid areas that meet one of four criteria, or more than one. It's either too hot or too cold, it's too wet or too dry. Okay, so for instance, in South America, the rainforest, too wet. Okay, people don't live in the rainforest because it's too wet. We're talking about northern Canada up here, it's too cold. The desert, too dry, arguably also too hot. If we look at this is kind of the equator right along here-ish, give or take, I don't know. And then we're into also a lot of too hot. Okay, so just some things to think about when you're looking at where our population's at. Okay, and again, density does not show distribution, and density is a poor substitute for distribution. So to give you an example of really the way this works out, we're going to look at a specific country, and in this case we're going to look at the country of Egypt. Okay, so Egypt's current population as of this morning, September 30th, 2016, was about 94 million people. Okay, which gives it about 1.25% of the world's population, and the population density when we look at it is 94 people per square mile. Okay, so keep that in mind, 94 people per square mile. Basically between 0 and 5 people live over here in all this kind of white peachish area. We've got a few more, let's see, that's what, 10 to 25 about right there, maybe 25 to 50. This is, that 10 to 25 range. You'll notice they're right along the coast, but where do most of the people live? This is the the lower Nile Valley. Okay, and then along here, what's along here? Oh wait, it's the Nile River, right? So when we talk about Egypt, 40% of folks live in urban areas. And by the way, I stole this from the website worldometers.info. Okay. But 40% of people live in urban areas. They live in cities. Cities are large towns. Okay. And we talk about, when we look at historical influences, right, and current influences, what we're really looking at, again, people tend to live close to the Nile when we ask, or to the coast, and we ask, why is that the case? Because the Nile every year floods, and part of that flooding historically has been part of what it does is provide nutrients to the land. So that's really the arable land. That's the best land for growing things on. And indeed, for many, 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 many years, Egypt was really the breadbasket of the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the Mediterranean Sea up here at the top of the map. Okay, so they were exporting grain to the Roman Empire for a lot of years and into Europe. Right, and even so, that's some of the historical influences, but that continues to hold true even today, right? Even with the advent of modern air conditioning, this area down here is still very inhospitable to live in, and people tend to cluster in areas where there's easy transportation, hence the decision to live along the coast. Okay, but also where it's a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter. Again, when you live near large bodies of water, you tend to get more rain. So it's wetter, it also keeps it a little bit cooler, right? And people tend to live where they can find the resources that they need. And again, that's going to be in that Nile River basin. So Egypt is a great example of the reason why it's really poor practice to use population density to talk about population distribution. Okay, because again, if we look at the density, it's 94 people per square mile, which means we should really see, like, the entire country should be the shade of orangish. What do we see? Oh no, we see somewhere between 1 and 5,000 people living basically all along this area, and then almost nobody in most of the rest of the country. So if you have any questions, I'd invite you to bring them into class and ask them of me, and otherwise I will see you the next time we meet.